So recently we set up the catio, and I mentioned at the end of that video that I wanted to have some kind of bench underneath this window, a nice place for us to sit, and also it'll be easier for the cats to jump out of the window onto the bench and then onto the patio. The trouble is we've got a limited amount of space between this concrete step and the edge of the patio, which measures 35 centimetres. I'm going to be making this entire project using salvaged roof battens. These were ripped off the roof of our bungalow last year when we had it re-roofed, and I kept them all aside. But later in the video I'll explain how much a project like this would cost if you were buying new roof battens, and it works out really cheap. My battens measure 38 by 25 millimeters, but you can also get 50 by 25 mil battens, which would give you an even chunkier bench. I want the legs of my bench to be splayed out by 10 degrees, so the majority of the cuts will need this angle to be cut on them. And there are plans and a cut list for this project available. There'll be a link in the description box below. The bench is made up of 5 different components. The first component is the top piece, which gets a 10-degree angle on each end. The second is the leg piece, which also needs a 10-degree cut at each end. I managed to make one of my cuts in the wrong direction though, so that will come back to bite me later on. The third is the bottom leg joiners, which are really short, so I can't use my stop block here, so I'm just going to work to a line on the miter saw fence. That's just to make sure that each piece is exactly the same size. And again, 10 degrees on each end. The fourth is the bottom rail, again 10 degrees at each end. And finally the top joining pieces, which are the only pieces that will have 90-degree cuts at both ends. And with all the cutting done, it's the arduous task of sanding, but I'm only going to sand the inside faces, and I'm not looking for perfection either. This timber is rough sawn, and that's fine. This is going to be a rustic garden bench, but what I don't want is splintering or anything that's going to catch on clothing or skin or anything like that. Right, so that's all my pieces now ready to assemble. I have done a 3D drawing for this build, just so that I know what sequence to put things in. And the very first layer is a top piece. And then I'm going to find the center of that, as that's where I'll need to place one of my spacers. I'm just going to make sure that's nice and centered, and then I'm going to measure to the end, and that measurement is 498. So I'm going to place each one 498 in from that end. That way they should all line up nicely. And I'm using a polyurethane adhesive for this. It's a D4 adhesive, which means it's good for outdoor use. I'm just going to use a couple of these as spacers temporarily, which will help me get my legs positioned, and I just need to make sure that my legs are angled in the right direction. I've only put one screw in the top of the legs for now, because these legs might need to be repositioned, and I've just realised that I've cut the angles the wrong way. I'm going to ignore that for now, and we'll figure that out later. What an idiot. I can now get another top piece on, make sure everything's lined up nicely. Before I get those screws added, I just want to make sure that my legs have the right splay. So I'm going to position my bottom of leg pieces. And now I can offer up my bottom brace piece and just make sure that the legs are positioned correctly. And that looks about right there, so I wasn't far off. And now I can get this glued in. From this point on, it's just repeating that same process, and now I know that everything's positioned correctly, so it should be easy from here on in. This is my first time using the polyurethane glue by Soudal. Before, I've always used the stuff by Everbuild, but I actually much prefer this stuff because it doesn't foam up as much, so it's much less messy to work with, and it has a much better nozzle and lid too. I'll leave a link to this adhesive below. The screws I'm using are just regular woodworking screws, not stainless steel or decking screws, which would be the best choice for outdoor use typically, but I'm only really using them to get the joins nice and tight anyway, as it's going to be the glue that does all the hard work here. Really, I'm just using the screws instead of clamps. I'm also staggering all my screws so that they don't hit the screws underneath, as you can see here. Right, one mistake is never enough, is it? So I thought I'd make a second one just for you. As you might be able to see, I've messed up the ordering of these bottom slats. So I'm going to cut another one and add it to the middle here, just so that it's symmetrical. There's no functional reason to add another one, but I'm just going to do it anyway, just because it'll look better. Just a couple of these bottom rails is more than enough in terms of strength, but I'm going to run 2 in the centre as well. You could even have 1 in each gap if you wanted to. In fact, looking back at this project, I kind of regret not doing that, because I think if that bottom was slatted like the top, the whole bench would look better. Anyway, I managed to get this extra one fitted. Right, let's try it out. It's plenty solid enough. There was a little bit of flex in it, but the central joining pieces and the bottom rails definitely help. The central joiners reduce the span and lock the top panel all together so that there's much less flex, and the bottom rails ensure that the leads can't spread apart when weight is applied to the top. Even so though, 50mm roof battens would probably make this even more sturdy, so that would be my recommendation if you were looking to build one of these. Right, now to correct that first mistake. So I'm setting my circular saw to 20 degrees, and I can make a cut so that the legs are angled 10 degrees in the opposite direction, as that's how they should have been cut in the first place at the miter saw. And you can see in this footage that the angle is a little bit off, unfortunately. Either that or I just didn't sit my base plate flat enough to the sides of the bench. I'm not sure, but it wasn't too much of a problem as I'm going to be hitting these with the belt sander anyway, so that's when I could make sure that the bottom of the legs are nice and flat so that they sit nicely on the floor. And I sanded the rest of the bench too. Again, this is a rustic bench, so I'm not going to get the random orbit sander out for this one. I just want to get rid of any splinters or gnarly bits. And I rounded over the edges too. I applied a couple of coats of preserver on the cut ends of my bench, which will help prevent rot and insect damage. I did double check that this is pet safe, as obviously this bench is going to be in the catio, and on the tin it says once dry it's animal safe, so that's good. And I used a filler to fill some of the old nail holes. I'm adding an exterior wood stain. The colour of this is dark oak and the coverage is really good, so I can get away with just 1 coat here. And I'm going to add some plastic feet to the bottom. Actually, these are plastic door stops, but they'll lift the bench up off the ground so that it doesn't soak up moisture. So it functions well as a bench, but does it function as an easier route into the catio for the cats? Let's try Hazel first. That's classic Hazel. Trust nothing. Now let's try Mickey.
Come on.
And that's classic Mickey. Trust everything. You can build this bench with just 7 3.6 metre roofing battens for the 50 by 25mm ones. If you go to any timber merchant that does pressure treated battens, you can expect to pay about £3.60 per batten. Obviously prices will vary depending on where you are, but that's a total of just £25.20. If you prefer to shop at one of the big DIY stores, it's going to cost you basically double that. Expect to pay about £7 per batten, so roughly £49 in total. Add on the cost of some glue, preserver and screws if you don't have them already, and you'll probably spend about another £25. Don't forget plans and a cut list is available at the link in the description box if you'd like to make one of these. It was incredibly quick to build, it took just 5 hours, and it cost me nothing as it was made of stuff I had laying around already.